Thanks for that, Janet. Thank you for that introduction. So, Ruth and I are going to do a little bit of a double act in terms of this presentation, just give a bit of an overview of our research and draw out some of the key evidence from the work that we've been involved in. Hopefully, everyone can see the slides there. So I think this research has really been ongoing for the last few years. It comes out of a wider study of working conditions in hospitality. Within that, we ended up focusing on workplace sexual harassment as one of the key issues that hospitality workers face. And as we kind of go through some of the evidence and some of the research, I think you'll see the ways in which some of our findings, some of our conclusions are applicable to a range of other industries. So starting off with thinking about the distribution of workplace sexual harassment. I mean, we're 40 years onwards from the first cases, the first legal cases in the UK that define sexual harassment as a form of sex discrimination. But within that period, there's really been an absolute failure to systematically record prevalence of sexual harassment. So we don't really know anything in terms of longer term trends of whether sexual harassment is going up or down. I think what we can say, inferring from other evidence and other forms of sexual violence, is that things probably improved for some time in the 80s and 90s, but in more recent decades, there's been something of a backlash against women's rights. There's been a decline in women's bargaining position in terms of employment and in the household. And I think some anecdotal evidence to suggest that the issue may have been getting worse more recently. What we have got in the wake of the Me Too movement is a number of surveys, discrete standalone surveys that have been conducted in the UK that have tried to measure sexual harassment and at least provide a snapshot at a single point in time. So a couple of surveys by the BBC in 2017 and then one by the Government Equalities Office in 2020. Now, what those surveys show is that workplace sexual harassment is endemic. So 1/3 of workers experience some form of sexual harassment on an annual basis. It is overwhelmingly gendered. So some surveys show that women experience twice as much sexual harassment as men. Other surveys like the GEO suggest that it's a smaller difference, but actually what men are experiencing are the less severe forms of workplace sexual harassment, people sharing lewd material within the workplace, whereas women are subject to the most serious forms of sexual harassment, up to and including sexual
Sorry, I'm
assault.
multitasking today. I'm trying to do all of the meetings and get all of my work done at the same time.
Uh-huh.
So you have a son. He is a little bit lazy. Your foster son?
Yes.
Sorry, I think is there someone who is not muted?
No.
Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, so where were we? Yeah, so looking at the prevalence of workplace sexual harassment, I think we have strong grounds for arguing that because sexual harassment is overwhelmingly gendered, it should be seen as a form of violence against women and girls. Sexual harassment is also an abuse of power, and it's facilitated through power differentials between perpetrators and victim survivors. So Weinstein, whose case in many ways helped launch the Me Too movement, can be considered kind of archetypical in this respect. So he was an individual who controlled access to an entire industry, the movie industry, and he was able to use that market power to commission his acts of abuse. Now, our research does focus in on the hospitality sector more discreetly. So you can see from the graph on the screen in front of you that this BBC survey from 2017, like many others, shows that hospitality has the highest levels of workplace sexual harassment. So 55% of women working in hospitality have ever experienced it, compared to 23% of men. But what you'll also note is that there isn't vast differences within the other between the other sectors, and this is an issue that is experienced widely across the entire economy. I think it's also worth highlighting that some interesting research has come out of the United States in the last couple of years. And what they did was a survey where they took examples which categorically met the legal definition of workplace sexual harassment. And they asked workers in different industries to say, do you think that is sexual harassment? And what they found was that in the most sexually harassing industries, like hospitality, workers were least likely to understand behaviours as sexual harassment, meaning that in those industries it's just kind of normalized, it's taken for granted. So what this actually suggests is, however high official data puts sexual harassment in hospitality, for instance, the truth is that it's probably even higher than that. And I'll hand over Ruth to talk a little bit about worker experiences.
Thank you. So just for a bit of context then, so our research drew from a subsample of hospitality workers, and they were interviewed as part of a wider study into low paid and precarious work, and these took place between 2018 and 2021. And as Bob sort of mentioned, this was the purpose of this was to explore working conditions in a number of sectors and what the harms of work are associated with insecure and low paid work. And around half of our interviews related to the hospitality sector. And that's about 30 workers, and 20 of those mentioned sexual harassment in some form, and 11 of them mentioned it in sufficient depth to kind of build these stories up of what was happening. So all of the participants who shared experiences of sexual harassment and unwanted sexual attention with us were women ranging in age, from 20 to 31. And indeed, all but one of them were 25 and under. So these were young women. Two of them were Black British, two were from migrant minoritized ethnic backgrounds, and the remainder were white British. And we mention this because for those workers, often sexual harassment was just one of many harms experienced at work. And often some of those harms were racist and racialized. Similarly, there was one participant who was identified as LGBT, and her experience of sexual harassment had experiences of homophobia tied up within it. So those were the women who participated, and just to kind of give you a sort of overview of these stories they shared with us, what some of the kind of key findings were that stood out, and these were very shocking when we sort of were analysing their data and the stories they'd shared. So the first thing that really stood out was, oh, can you go back? Sorry, Bob. I did a bit of preamble there that wasn't on the slide. The first thing that really stood out was that mostly all of them had multiple experiences of sexual harassment, and this kind of manifested in different ways. So this could be that they had experienced it more than once, perpetrated by the same individual. So it could be a sort of campaign of sexual harassment perpetrated by one person. It could be that they had experienced multiple forms of sexual harassment by different people in the same job. So it was happening from customers and from colleagues. Or they told us about different jobs they'd had in their lifetime, and they'd been sexually harassed in more than one job. And I think that was something that really stood out to us, was almost how repetitive, how frequently this occurred. Something that was also quite noticeable to us was sort of thinking about who that perpetrator was, and sort of realizing that in the job it could be anyone. So the workers experienced harassment from someone who either had a direct line of authority over them, so a manager, supervisor. It could be a colleague who had a sort of same level as power as them in the workplace, or it could be a customer. But I think what we felt was really crucial to sort of understand about this was that whether the perpetrator was management or not, nearly always management were involved in some way, and in a way that was sort of an abuse of power to the victim survivor of it, because management often ignored their complaints or put them in the situation where they were more likely to be harassed. Sadly, nearly all of them had had really poor experiences of reporting sexual harassment. Sometimes they felt unable to report it. Sometimes when they did, it was kind of brushed off or met with indifference. And in some cases, the women were victimized for reporting it and were treated detrimentally because they had reported sexual harassment that was happening to them. And I think the kind of crucial thing to finish on, and something that was noticeable in the stories we heard and is very sort of visible in the evidence that exists on sexual harassment, is that often the only way out is to leave the job, and that for many of the women that was the only way that they felt it was dealt with, was they had to leave their role. So I'm just going to run you through now just 3 examples to sort of give you a flavour of what sort of experiences were happening, and some of the women, hear a bit more about some of the women we spoke to. So the first person was Jane. So all the names have been anonymized. She was 24 years old, and her most recent job was in catering for a subcontractor, where there had been a string of different owners in recent years, and with each change, they'd cut various benefits from the workers' contracts. So Jane was employed full time, but her wage was close to the national minimum wage. And she'd been in this role for 5 years in the transport industry. But not long after she started working, a much older co-worker started to make her feel really uncomfortable. So it started out with him just talking to her, and escalated into him giving her gifts, and turned into stalking behaviour. And what was really awful about it was that she reported this to her line manager, who responded by covertly observing her in her job to see if she was trying to be flirtatious, implying that she had brought this behaviour on herself in some way. So I think that's a good example, we felt, of where, this wasn't perpetrated by a manager, but management had certainly been involved in a really negative way. So the next person was Isabella, who was 20 when we interviewed her. So she was on a 0 hours contract and paid close to the national minimum wage. And she worked at a popular fast food restaurant. So when Isabella, in this role, was subject to a sustained period of sexual harassment by a manager who, she was 17 when this started. This manager was 26, although he lied about his age. He eavesdropped on a conversation that she was having, sort of about the fact that she'd recently split up with a boyfriend, and then used this as an opportunity to start asking her questions about her personal life and her sex life. And it escalated to him stalking her outside of work. What was really awful for Isabella about this is that this manager used his power as the manager to have access to her and to sexually harass her. So this included making sure that their breaks were always scheduled together. And when he was promoted and got greater control of the rota, he made sure that they were always placed on shift together. She reported this manager several times to more senior management, but she said that they gaslit her. They refused to explore it, but also to sort of explore her complaint, but also sort of questioned her interpretation of things, and whether his behaviour was inappropriate, even though it so clearly was. Next one, please, Bob. And then the final story we thought we'd share with you, Awira, who was 25. She sort of told us about the experiences of sexual harassment from customers. So she worked in a nightclub. And what was really awful was that she was sort of subject to systematic sexual harassment from customers, all different people, but it was a sort of like really routine, mundane, almost expected part of the job. So she was put on glass collect, so she would have to walk around collecting glasses. And she said she would get assaulted. Someone would walk past and touch her. They would say inappropriate things. And she told us that this happened sort of multiple times a night. And it wasn't taken seriously by management. Sometimes, she would try and complain or ask the bouncers to intervene. But the issue would be that sometimes by the time she'd done that, the perpetrator could have actually gone. And Awira was somebody who, as well, really sadly, who had experienced this kind of like almost daily experience from customers, but also reported to us being sexually harassed by a colleague at work, which wasn't dealt with at all, and also had experienced sexual harassment in another job. So it was this really kind of prevalent experience for her in her working life. I'll hand back over to Bob now.
Thanks, Ruth. So I'm just going to talk through some of the factors that, from our analysis in our research, we believe help to explain why particular groups of workers and particular industries have such high levels of sexual harassment. I think, first of all, we need to think about what we call demographic vulnerabilities, so related to people's ethnicity, their gender, their sexuality, and so on. And I think what an analysis of all survey data shows is that all disadvantaged, minoritized, vulnerable groups are much more likely to face workplace sexual harassment. So we've talked about that in relation to gender, but as you can see on the graph, it's younger workers who are more at risk, it's minoritized ethnicities, it's transgender, lesbian, gay and bisexual workers, and those with a highly limiting disability. Now, part of the explanation for this, of course, is societal discrimination, bigotry, sexism, ableism, racism, and so on. But there are also factors that concentrate vulnerable workers in particular industries like hospitality. So hospitality is a low profit industry with high levels of competitive pressures and also rent seeking, it has to be said, by large multinational companies who are extracting a lot of value from these businesses. And that, in combination with sometimes government policies like youth rates of the national minimum wage or visa requirements, serve to funnel vulnerable workers into particular industries. And these are vulnerable workers. I mean, to take one example, younger workers in hospitality, they're less likely to have knowledge of their employment rights. And we know that education around employment rights in this country is sadly lacking. So they are more vulnerable to abuses in the workplace. Similarly, migrant workers, because of perhaps concerns around citizenship and visa eligibility, are also much more likely to be exploited. Secondly, we talk about contractual vulnerabilities. And here, although generally speaking, the evidence around the survey evidence, the statistics around workplace sexual harassment are inadequate, actually, both in the UK, the European Union, Australia, around the world, we have really solid evidence that in all contexts, workers on precarious contracts, fixed term contracts, 0 hour, variable hour, freelance contracts are all much more likely to be at risk of sexual harassment. So the BBC survey, the statistics that were shown on the screen, those on 0 hour contracts are 1.5 times more likely as any other workers in employment to face workplace sexual harassment. So this we can explain in terms of what Alex Wood calls manager-controlled flexible scheduling. This is basically where managers have control over the rota, control over the hours that workers can access, and essentially control over the workers' ability to make ends meet, to bring in enough money to sustain themselves. The way in which this is kind of implicated in abuses of power, I think, are fairly obvious. But one example that stood out in our research was Olivia, who was subject to sexual harassment at a chain restaurant she was working at. She was actually brave enough to report that, to take that to the restaurant manager to try and seek redress. And as a result of her complaint, she had her hours cut for several weeks as a form of retaliation. So we can see how these precarious contracts are massively disempowering for workers. I think thirdly, we've got what we call deregulatory vulnerabilities. So the inadequate regulation of sexual harassment in the UK, but also processes of labour market deregulation that have took place over the last 30 or 40 years, to the extent to which we actually argue that in many ways, workplace sexual harassment is effectively deregulated in the UK. So firstly, it's not treated as a health and safety issue like violence in the workplace would be, and like it is in other jurisdictions such as the Netherlands and Australia. Secondly, the only effective regulator, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, is reactive rather than proactive. It has limited powers, again, in comparison to the Health and Safety Executive that regulates other aspects of health and safety in the workplace, and it lacks funding. So the EHRC has had 2/3 of its budget cut in the last 2 decades. I think beyond that, bringing sexual harassment cases really in this country depends on a very individualized process through the employment tribunal system. And we know that workers face multiple barriers, including time limits, which pay no regard to the well-documented evidence around the time it takes victim survivors of sexual harassment to come to terms with their treatment and to then actually speak out. Secondly, the financial and emotional costs of going through the tribunal system, and we know that ordinary workers are significantly outgunned by employers. And then thirdly, and really concerningly, the documented evidence we have of misogyny, racism and classism in the tribunal system, which means that women in general and particular kinds of women specifically are less likely to get a fair hearing. So before I pass back over to Ruth for some concluding thoughts, I want to talk a little bit about how we contest workplace sexual harassment. Now, for me as a trade unionist, fundamentally part of this has got to be trade union campaigning, and many unions have to up their game on this issue, frankly. But it is also a question of government regulation, and of course this is part of why we're involved in this campaign. Now, in terms of thinking about what that regulation should look like, I think a really good starting point is the International Labour Organization Convention on Violence and Harassment, which the UK government brought in 2022, but is yet to fully implement. And some of the things that the ILO Convention 190 calls for are the creation of laws and policies to prevent workplace sexual harassment. We've had the Work Protection Act, but there's been limitations in that around a watering down of the requirements on employers to prevent workplace sexual harassment. The ILO Convention also calls for the establishment and strengthening of appropriate enforcement and monitoring mechanisms. And in this country, we have no systematic annual monitoring of workplace sexual harassment across the economy, which also implements best practice around anonymous and third-party reporting. And then finally, the ILO also calls for effective means of inspection and investigation. And the EHRC has no systematic powers of investigation in the way that the Health and Safety Executive does. And of course, that's a key call for the Ed Not Defend campaign. So I'll bring Ruth back in to talk about where we're taking this research next.
Thank you. Yeah, so one of the things that we wanted to share with you is the next piece of research that we're doing, and we're doing this in collaboration with the Workers' Policy Project. So obviously some of those campaigns and not campaigns, sorry, policy changes that are being introduced, legislative changes that are being introduced that Bob's mentioned are very welcome. But one of the things that, is quite well evidenced is that there is still a lot of difficulty for workers to come. Oh, sorry, my doorbell's going off. It's still very difficult for workers to come forward and for people to come forward when they have been a victim of sexual harassment and to recognise their experiences as sexual harassment. Oh, I think the slides changed, Bob. Have I done that? Have you done that? I don't know if I have control over it. Sorry.
Yeah. Is that back up?
And so, sorry, what I was saying is that we want to explore how we might reframe the phrase sexual harassment, and that might be within sort of campaigns, conversations, information and resources with workers, how we might reframe it in a way that is relatable, inclusive. We know that people struggle to come forward and identify experiences that they've had as sexual harassment. Now, obviously, that can relate to a range of different reasons why that might be the case, and we know that often reporting mechanisms are really poor, and as Bob was saying, tribunals have many barriers to them. But some of the reasons why people might not recognize their experiences of sexual harassment as sexual harassment is because of the stigma involved in that, kind of victim blaming narratives, the normalization and routine nature of sexual violence, and also a worker's lack of knowledge of their rights. And I think, what's kind of been identified by some of the academic literature that exists out there is that framing sort of experiences of sexual violence as sexual harassment has kind of been posited at times as a sort of important political step for challenging it. But framing things kind of purely in a legal way doesn't necessarily match people's like lived experiences of what's happened. So one thing, as I said, that we're planning to do, this new piece of research, is kind of do some research with workers themselves about what they think sexual harassment is, what behaviours they would include in that and have experienced, and what language they would use to describe it, so that we can start to have these conversations and build these resources in a way that we hope will be meaningful to workers and will to match what experiences they're having, and support them to come forward. As I think it's really important that we're seeing legislative changes, but if people aren't reporting experiences of sexual harassment, if they're not able to come forward in the first place, then that legislation isn't necessarily protecting them in the way that we would hope. And so, yeah, we hope to be able to, we're sort of moving on with that now, and obviously it'll be great to be able to share that with everyone when we've started work on that. So I think just that brings our presentation to a close. I mean, we have, if you would like to read our report, there's the information on how to download it. And thank you. I think that's everything.